On a desolate highway in the Deep South, a Black War veteran named Marcus pulls into a gas station, his dog tags clinking softly. As he steps out of his truck, he notices a gang of leather-clad bikers surrounding a young waitress near the diner. A hush falls over the scene as Marcus approaches. His calm demeanor masks years of combat experience, but what happens next isn't a fight. It's a reckoning that will change lives forever. Marcus drove his battered pickup truck down a lonely stretch of highway, the South Carolina sun dipping low on the horizon. The road stretched endlessly, mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. 2 decades of military service had left their marks on his body, his mind, and his spirit. He hadn't planned on coming back here, to a town that held nothing but ghosts, but the truck's dwindling gas gauge forced his hand. A flickering neon sign ahead read Maggie's Gas and Diner, promising fuel and a momentary reprieve. Pulling into the gravel lot, Marcus stepped out, his boots crunching on the ground. The scent of oil and fried food hung in the air. He stretched, scanning his surroundings. His eyes landed on a group of men gathered near the diner entrance. Leather jackets, loud laughter, and gleaming motorcycles. It was a gang of bikers, and they seemed to be enjoying themselves a little too much. At first, Marcus dismissed them as background noise, his focus on filling up and moving on. But then he caught a voice, a young woman's, trembling and desperate. He turned to see her, a waitress in a faded uniform cornered against the diner wall. One of the bikers leaned in close, grinning maliciously. "Come on, sweetheart, we're just having fun," the man said, his tone oily. Marcus froze. He hadn't come looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. The waitress's pleading eyes and the biker's cruel laughter stirred something deep within him. Adjusting his hat, he walked toward the diner. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but steady. The waitress glanced at him, her fear palpable. She didn't speak, but her silence spoke volumes. The bikers turned their attention to Marcus, their amusement shifting to irritation. "This ain't your business, old man," said one of them, stepping forward. He was tall and burly, his jacket adorned with patches that hinted at past skirmishes. Marcus stood his ground, his dog tags clinking faintly under his shirt. "Seems like it is now," Marcus replied evenly. The leader of the gang, a man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped into the fray. He smirked, looking Marcus up and down. "You sure you want to do this? You don't know who you're dealing with." "I've dealt with worse," Marcus said, meeting his gaze without flinching. The 2 men stared each other down, the bikers encircling them like vultures. Marcus knew the odds weren't in his favor, but he didn't care. He'd faced worse in combat zones, and he wasn't about to back down now. The waitress took a hesitant step closer to him, her voice barely audible. "Thank you," she whispered. "Get inside," Marcus said, not taking his eyes off the bikers. She hesitated, but obeyed, darting into the diner. One of the bikers moved to intercept her, but Marcus stepped in his path, his presence alone enough to halt the man. "You don't want to do that," Marcus warned, his voice as cold as steel. For a moment, everything was still. The bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering under Marcus's unyielding gaze. He wasn't armed, but the way he carried himself, calm, confident, and utterly unshaken, gave them pause. The leader's smirk widened. "You've got guts. Let's see if you've got anything else." Marcus didn't respond. His silence spoke louder than words, and in that silence the bikers began to realize this wasn't going to go the way they'd expected. The air outside the diner grew heavy as Marcus and the bikers squared off. Snake, the scar-faced leader, circled Marcus slowly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the man in front of him. "You've got guts," Snake said, his voice low and mocking. "But guts won't help you here." Marcus stood motionless, his face calm and unreadable. "Maybe not," he replied, "but they've gotten me through worse." The gang shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado dimming. Snake leaned closer, his grin predatory. You a cop or something? Trying to play hero?" "Just a man who knows when to step in," Marcus said. Snake chuckled, though his amusement didn't reach his eyes. "All right then. Let's settle this, old school. No weapons, just fists. You win, we'll leave the girl alone. You lose, well, you won't like losing." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "Fine." The bikers cheered, eager for a show. They formed a rough circle in the gravel lot, their motorcycles gleaming under the dim lights. Snake rolled his shoulders, clearly confident. Marcus, on the other hand, stood relaxed, his stance deliberate and controlled. The fight began with Snake charging forward, throwing a wild punch meant to intimidate. Marcus dodged effortlessly, his movements precise and calculated. Snake stumbled, his grin faltering. "Is that all you've got?" Marcus asked, his voice even. Snake growled, coming at him again with more force. This time, Marcus countered, delivering a sharp jab to Snake's ribs. The bikers jeered, their confidence in their leader beginning to waver. Snake swung again, but Marcus sidestepped and landed a clean blow to Snake's jaw. The leader staggered, his bravado crumbling. Within minutes, it was over. Snake lay on the ground, clutching his ribs and gasping for air. Marcus stepped back, his breathing steady, and turned his gaze to the rest of the gang. "Anyone else?" he asked, his tone calm but commanding. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of them muttered, "Let's go." Snake glared up at Marcus, his face twisted with anger. "This isn't over," he spat. "It is for tonight," Marcus replied. The gang helped Snake to his feet, their earlier swagger gone. They mounted their motorcycles and roared off into the night, leaving behind a cloud of dust and silence. The waitress emerged from the diner, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus gave her a small nod and turned back to his truck. As he climbed in, his thoughts lingered on Snake's parting words. He knew trouble wasn't far off, and when it came, he'd be ready. The glow of the diner's neon sign faded in the rearview mirror as Marcus pulled onto the dark highway. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the cracked leather. He didn't like the way Snake had looked at him before leaving. Men like that didn't take defeat lightly, and Marcus knew their paths would cross again. It was only a matter of when. A few miles down the road, Marcus pulled over at a rest stop. The adrenaline from the fight had begun to wear off, replaced by the familiar weight of exhaustion. He sat in the truck for a moment, staring out at the empty lot before stepping out to stretch his legs. Inside the rest stop's dimly lit bathroom, Marcus splashed cold water on his face, the memory of Snake's parting words echoing in his mind. He caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him was older, wearier, but there was still steel in his eyes, a resolve forged in battlefields far from home. He'd thought he'd left that part of his life behind, but tonight had proved otherwise. As he stepped outside, the sound of approaching motorcycles cut through the night. Marcus's jaw tightened as the distant hum grew into a deafening roar. The gang was back. The gang rolled into the rest stop parking lot, their headlights illuminating the pavement like searchlights. Snake dismounted first, his movements slow and deliberate, a predator stalking its prey. His ribs were bandaged, but his expression was pure venom. "Told you it wasn't over," Snake said, his voice carrying across the lot. Marcus didn't respond. He stood his ground, his hands loose at his sides, ready for whatever came next. Snake gestured to the gang, and two bikers stepped forward, their steps heavy with menace. Marcus sized them up quickly, his mind calculating every possible move. The first biker lunged, swinging wildly, but Marcus sidestepped and delivered a precise elbow to the man's jaw. The second hesitated, caught off guard by Marcus's speed, and that split second was all Marcus needed. He swept the man's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining bikers looked to Snake for direction, their earlier confidence shaken. Snake snarled, his hand going to the knife at his belt, but he hesitated, clearly reconsidering. Marcus locked eyes with him. "You don't want to do this." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Snake laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you're some kind of savior? This ain't over, old man." Snake mounted his bike, signaling the others to follow. One by one, the gang roared out of the parking lot, their taillights disappearing into the darkness. Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He knew tonight had only been a preview. Snake wasn't the type to let things go, and the stakes were getting higher. As Marcus climbed back into his truck, a thought crossed his mind. If Snake wanted a war, he might just get one. But it wouldn't end the way Snake expected. The highway stretched on, empty and silent. But Marcus's thoughts weren't. The encounter at the rest stop confirmed what he already knew. Snake wasn't done. Marcus sensed the escalation brewing, a storm he'd seen too many times. He drove without a destination, calculating his next move. An hour later, Marcus spotted a small motel on the roadside. Its flickering vacancy sign cast weak light onto the gravel lot. He pulled in, parked his truck, and stepped inside the cramped lobby. The clerk, a wiry man with tired eyes, barely looked up as Marcus paid for a room. The room was modest, a bed, a nightstand, and a faded television. Marcus sat on the bed's edge, his gaze fixed on his dog tags. They felt heavier tonight, reminders of battles fought and the toll they'd taken. He wasn't young anymore, but instincts honed by decades of service hadn't dulled. As Marcus lay back, his body ached. Sleep came reluctantly, his mind racing. How far would Snake go? How many men would he bring next time? How could Marcus prepare? Sometime in the early morning, Marcus awoke to a sound, the low rumble of motorcycles. His pulse quickened. He rolled silently off the bed, his movements smooth and practiced. Peering through the curtain, he counted 4 bikes in the lot. The riders stood in a loose circle, their voices low but urgent. "We wait till he comes out," one said. "Snake wants him alive." "Alive for now," another muttered. Marcus stepped back. He needed to act fast. Quietly, he moved to the bathroom and opened the small window. The drop wasn't far, and the darkness worked in his favor. Within minutes, Marcus was outside, crouched in the shadows. The bikers hadn't noticed his absence. They stood near his truck, their backs to him. Marcus crept closer, his movements silent. He couldn't afford to take them all on at once. The first biker didn't know what hit him. Marcus struck with precision, knocking the man unconscious before he could make a sound. The second turned just in time to see Marcus closing in, but it was too late. Marcus disarmed him and delivered a knockout blow. The remaining 2 bikers scrambled. One reached for a gun, but Marcus disarmed him with practiced ease. The last hesitated, his hands raised in surrender. "Don't," Marcus said, his voice cold. The biker dropped his weapon and backed away. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," he stammered. "Then leave," Marcus said. "Tell Snake this ends now. He doesn't want what's coming." The man nodded quickly, mounting his bike and speeding off. Marcus watched him go, his expression grim. The message was sent, but Snake wouldn't take it well. As dawn broke, Marcus climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving the unconscious bikers behind. He didn't know where he was going, but one thing was certain. He couldn't run forever. Snake would keep coming, and Marcus would need to face him head-on. But not yet. First, he needed to prepare. The horizon stretched before him, vast and uncertain, but Marcus felt the familiar stirrings of determination. He'd fought tougher enemies in tougher places, and he wasn't about to lose now. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next town Marcus drove into was quiet, its main street lined with faded storefronts. He parked near a hardware store, its weathered sign swinging in the breeze. He needed supplies, not just for the road, but for whatever Snake was planning. Inside, he picked up rope, duct tape, a flashlight, and a sturdy multi-tool. The clerk, a kind woman with sharp eyes, gave him a curious look but didn't ask questions. As Marcus loaded the items into his truck, he noticed a man watching him from across the street. The man was older, maybe in his 60s, with a lean frame and piercing eyes. He nodded at Marcus in a way that felt deliberate. Marcus returned the gesture but stayed wary. His instincts, sharpened by years of experience, told him to be cautious. At a small roadside inn, Marcus checked into a modest room and laid out his gear. He worked methodically, assembling a makeshift kit. It wasn't much, but he'd made do with less in the past. As night fell, Marcus sat by the window, the curtains drawn just enough to watch the street. The stillness of the town made him uneasy. His unease proved justified when a single motorcycle rolled into the lot. The rider dismounted, his figure shadowed but familiar. Marcus recognized him as the man who'd been watching earlier. Marcus stepped outside, his stance casual but alert. "You're the one they're after," the man said, his voice gravelly. Marcus studied him. The way the man stood, calm but ready, suggested he wasn't just a passerby. "Who are you?" Marcus asked. "Name's Roy," the man replied. "Used to ride with Snake's crew. Figured you might need some help." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Why the sudden interest?" Roy shrugged. "Don't like how Snake's running things, and I don't like seeing decent folks get dragged into his mess." Marcus didn't trust easily, but there was something genuine about Roy. "What do you know?" Roy pulled a map from his jacket and spread it on Marcus's truck. "Snake's holed up in an old warehouse 10 miles out. He's got at least a dozen guys with him. If you're planning to face him, you'll need more than rope and duct tape." Marcus nodded, already formulating a plan. "Why tell me this?" Roy smirked. "Let's just say I like rooting for the underdog." Marcus folded the map, slipping it into his jacket. "Thanks for the intel. But if you're lying—" "I'm not," Roy interrupted. "You'll see." As Roy walked away, Marcus felt the weight of the situation. Snake wasn't just seeking revenge, he was preparing for war. Back in his room, Marcus studied the map again. The warehouse was remote, surrounded by dense woods. It was the perfect setup for an ambush, but Marcus had faced worse. He packed his gear, double-checked his truck, and lay down to rest. His body was weary, but his mind stayed sharp. Tomorrow, he'd make his move. Snake thought he had the upper hand, but Marcus was no stranger to uneven odds. The game was about to change. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon as Marcus studied the map Roy had given him. The warehouse Snake was holed up inside at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by dense woods. It was isolated, the kind of place where no one would hear a commotion. Marcus had seen setups like this before, fortresses for men who thrived on control. He parked his truck a quarter-mile from the site and moved through the woods with practiced silence. From the cover of trees, he counted 3 sentries outside the warehouse, all armed but lax. Their predictable movements gave Marcus the opening he needed. One by one, he neutralized the guards. Each move was precise, silent, and efficient. The first 2 went down without a sound, dragged into the shadows. The third guard noticed something amiss, but Marcus was faster. Within minutes, the perimeter was clear. The steel door creaked as Marcus eased it open, the sound louder than he'd hoped. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with oil and sweat. Snake sat at a makeshift desk in the center of the room, his ribs still bandaged. 5 gang members were scattered nearby, their postures alert. Snake looked up and smirked. "Knew you'd come," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Marcus didn't respond. His eyes scanned the room, mapping exits and assessing threats. Snake leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence. "You came alone. Brave. Stupid, but brave." "I've faced worse odds," Marcus replied, his tone calm but deliberate. Snake's smirk widened, but Marcus moved before he could respond. Grabbing a loose pipe from the floor, Marcus struck the nearest man, sending him sprawling. Chaos erupted. Snake's men scrambled, but Marcus's training took over. Each strike was calculated, each movement deliberate. Within moments, Snake's men were down, groaning or unconscious. Snake stood, drawing a knife from his belt. He circled Marcus, his smirk replaced with a snarl. "You think this ends here?" he growled. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "It ends now." Snake lunged, but Marcus sidestepped, disarming him with a swift motion. Snake staggered, and Marcus drove him back against the desk. For a moment, their eyes met. Snake's filled with fury, Marcus's cold and unyielding. "This is over," Marcus said, his voice low but final. "Walk away while you still can." Snake hesitated, his bravado faltering. Finally, he dropped the knife and backed away, his face a mix of rage and defeat. "You'll regret this," he spat before limping toward the door. Marcus watched as Snake disappeared into the woods, the sound of his retreating footsteps echoing in the empty warehouse. The fight wasn't over, not completely, but Marcus knew he'd struck a blow Snake wouldn't recover from easily. As sunlight filtered through broken windows, Marcus stepped outside. The woods were quiet, the chaos of the night giving way to an uneasy calm. Marcus knew Snake's grudge wasn't dead, but for now, he'd won, and that was enough. The quiet after the confrontation didn't last. Marcus knew Snake wouldn't give up. Driving toward the next town, Marcus replayed the night's events, knowing Snake's determination was far from spent. By the time Marcus reached a rural gas station, his truck was running low on fuel. The town was eerily quiet. Inside the station, the clerk gave him a nervous glance. "Passing through?" the man asked. "Something like that," Marcus replied. The clerk hesitated, then leaned closer. "Heard some bikers asking about a guy. Matches your description." Marcus nodded grimly. Snake was expanding his reach. "Thanks for the heads up," he said, heading back to his truck. As Marcus pulled onto the main road, he saw Roy leaning against his motorcycle. Marcus stopped, his instincts on high alert. "You're not rid of him yet," Roy said. "Snake's regrouping, pulling in guys from neighboring towns. He wants this on his terms." "Why are you still helping me?" Marcus asked. Roy smirked faintly. "Maybe I'm tired of Snake running this place, or maybe I think you can take him down." Roy handed Marcus a map. "Old quarry, a few miles out. That's where they're setting up. You want to end this, that's where you go." Marcus glanced at the map, nodding. "Thanks for the intel. You sure about this?" "Sure as I can be," Roy replied, "but Snake's bringing more than men this time. He's got firepower." Marcus didn't flinch. "I've dealt with worse." As Marcus drove toward the quarry, the terrain grew rugged. Parking a safe distance away, he moved on foot. From a ridge overlooking the site, Marcus counted at least 15 armed men. Vehicles formed a loose perimeter, and crates of likely weapons were stacked near a central tent. Snake had fortified the area, but Marcus saw its weaknesses. As night fell, Marcus moved in silence. He rigged a fuel barrel to detonate, creating chaos in the camp. The explosion shattered the night, scattering Snake's men. Marcus moved swiftly, using the confusion to take out isolated guards and dismantle their defenses. Snake emerged from the central tent, his fury unmistakable. "Find him!" he roared, but his men were disorganized, their confidence shattered. Marcus stayed hidden, striking with precision. When the camp fell silent, only Snake remained. Marcus stepped into the light, his expression unreadable. Snake's hand twitched toward his weapon, but he froze, realizing he'd lost. "This is over," Marcus said. Snake sneered. "You think this ends with me?" "It ends now," Marcus replied. Snake lunged, but Marcus disarmed him swiftly, forcing him to the ground. For a moment, Marcus considered finishing it, but he stepped back instead. "You'll face justice," he said, leaving Snake to his fate. As dawn broke, Marcus walked away from the quarry. The battle was over, but Marcus knew his road ahead remained uncertain. For now, though, he had won. Marcus's victory at the quarry was bittersweet. Snake's operation was dismantled, but Marcus knew men like him left shadows, loyalists or those eager to fill the void. The fight wasn't truly over. After leaving the quarry, Marcus stopped at a diner off the highway. Its neon sign flickered weakly, casting an uneven glow over the gravel lot. Inside, the waitress greeted him warmly, offering coffee and pie. The normalcy was almost jarring, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past days. As Marcus sat at the counter, he couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Nearby, two truckers spoke in hushed tones. Their conversation drifted his way. "You hear about that warehouse fire?" one said. "Snake's gang got wiped out, but someone's out there looking for the guy who did it." Marcus stiffened but didn't turn. The waitress returned with his coffee. He finished quickly, leaving a generous tip, and slipped out into the night. The message was clear. Snake might be gone, but the threat lingered. That night, Marcus found a secluded campsite in the woods. He built a small fire and sat in its glow, listening to the quiet. But the quiet was deceptive. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch put him on edge. He knew better than to assume safety. In the early hours, the hum of engines broke the stillness. Marcus extinguished the fire and crouched low, scanning the darkness. A group of motorcycles approached, headlights cutting through the trees. The riders stopped at the clearing's edge. Their engines idled as one dismounted, his silhouette sharp against the glow of a headlight. "We're not here to fight," the man called out. "We just want to talk." Marcus didn't move, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "Talk, then," he said evenly. The man stepped forward, his hands raised in a show of peace. "Name's Cole," he said. "Rode with Snake years ago. Heard about what you did at the quarry." "And?" Marcus asked, his tone guarded. Cole hesitated, glancing back at the others. "Not all of us were loyal to Snake. Some of us want out. You're the first to stand up to him and win. We want to know, are you done, or are you looking to finish this?" Marcus studied him, his instincts on high alert. "Depends on what you mean by finish." "Snake's crew isn't just one gang," Cole said. "It's a network. If no one shuts it down, it'll regroup under someone worse. That's how these things go." Marcus exhaled slowly. The weight of Cole's words settled heavily. This wasn't just about Snake anymore. It was bigger. "I didn't ask for this," Marcus said. "No one ever does," Cole replied. "But you've got a choice. Walk away or help us end this for good." The other riders stayed back, their faces unreadable. Marcus looked at Cole and saw something unexpected. Hope. These men weren't looking for revenge. They were looking for a way out. After a long silence, Marcus nodded. "If you're serious about this, I'll help, but we do it my way." Relief flashed across Cole's face. "Fair enough," he said. As dawn broke, the group began to plan. Marcus used his military training to lay out their strategy. They went over maps, identified weak points, and prepared for the battles to come. The network Cole spoke of was sprawling, but Marcus had faced worse odds before. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't just another fight. It was a chance to dismantle something dangerous and give these men the freedom they sought. The road ahead would be long and perilous, but Marcus wasn't fighting alone anymore, and for the first time, he felt like this was a battle worth winning. With a plan in place, Marcus and the group prepared for their final mission. Cole's intel was clear. Snake's network was regrouping under a ruthless lieutenant named Viper. Their central hub was an abandoned shipping yard outside the city, fortified and heavily guarded. Marcus trained the group relentlessly. They weren't soldiers, but their resolve made up for their lack of experience. Together, they drilled strategies, learning to move as a unit. The small victories they'd achieved gave them confidence, but Marcus knew the final assault would test them all. The night before the mission, Marcus sat by the campfire, his thoughts heavy. Cole approached, his face shadowed with doubt. "Think we'll pull this off?" Cole asked. "It has to work," Marcus said. "We hit hard, disrupt their operation, and take out Viper. Without him, the network crumbles." Cole nodded but hesitated. "And if it doesn't?" Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "Then we fight harder." Under the cover of darkness, the group moved toward the shipping yard. Marcus had meticulously mapped their approach, identifying weak points in the perimeter. The yard was a maze of containers, guards patrolling with military precision. The first guards went down silently, Marcus leading the charge. Explosives were planted at key points to cripple the operation. As the first explosion shook the yard, chaos erupted. Guards scrambled as the group moved in, dismantling their defenses piece by piece. Viper emerged, barking orders and rallying his men. He was larger than Snake, his presence imposing. He spotted Marcus and snarled, "You think you can destroy what I've built?" "It ends tonight," Marcus said. Viper charged, his blows powerful but reckless. Marcus used his discipline and training to counter, each strike measured. The fight was brutal, but Marcus's precision won out. With a final move, he brought Viper to his knees. "You think this stops anything?" Viper spat. "There's always someone else." "Not this time," Marcus replied. He bound Viper and left him for the authorities, knowing his capture would dismantle the operation for good. As dawn broke, the group regrouped near the yard's entrance. Injuries were tended to, and the cost of the fight was evident. Cole joined Marcus, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," he said. Marcus nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "It's just the start," he said quietly. "But it's a start." For the first time in years, Marcus felt hope. The network was shattered, and those who'd fought beside him now had a chance to rebuild their lives. The battle was over, but the road ahead was still uncertain. And for Marcus, that was enough. The aftermath of the final battle was quiet, almost too quiet. Marcus stood at the edge of the shipping yard, the sun rising behind him, casting long shadows across the broken remnants of Snake's network. The smell of smoke and oil lingered in the air, but for the first time, Marcus felt a sense of closure. Cole and the others were tending to their wounded, their faces showing a mix of relief and exhaustion. Marcus walked toward them, his steps measured. Cole looked up, nodding at him. "We did it," he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Marcus gave a faint smile. "We did." The authorities arrived shortly after dawn. Viper and the remaining gang members were taken into custody, their operation officially dismantled. Marcus stood off to the side, watching as the officers loaded them into the back of their vehicles. He felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve. This was the end of one chapter, but he knew the road ahead would still hold challenges. As the officers drove away, Cole approached him. "What now?" he asked. Marcus glanced at the horizon, his gaze distant. "That's up to you. You've got a chance to start fresh, to build something better. Don't waste it." Cole hesitated, then extended a hand. Marcus shook it firmly. "We wouldn't have made it without you," Cole said. Marcus nodded. "Maybe. But you did the hard part. You stood up when it mattered." The group dispersed slowly, some returning to their families, others setting off to rebuild their lives. Marcus watched them go. A sense of pride mingled with the weight of his own journey. By midday, Marcus was back on the road. The highway stretched ahead, endless and uncertain. He had no destination, no clear path, but for the first time in years, he felt free. The memories of the past few weeks played in his mind. The battles, the allies he'd made, the lives he'd helped change. As the sun dipped lower, Marcus pulled over at a rest stop. He stepped out of the truck and leaned against it, watching the colors of the sunset paint the sky. His dog tags clinked softly as he adjusted his collar, a reminder of where he'd been and what he'd endured. A young boy approached holding a battered football. "Mister, you okay?" he asked, his voice curious. Marcus smiled faintly. "Yeah, kid, I'm okay." The boy nodded and ran off, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the peace of the moment settle over him. When he got back into the truck, Marcus started the engine and glanced at the horizon. The road called to him, not as a place to run from, but as a path to something new. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time, that was okay. Marcus drove into the twilight, the weight of the past easing with every mile. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living, and that, he realized, was victory enough.